All right. So let's jump to it. So yeah, the theme of my talk today is basically growth and specifically A/B testing, which is one of the main tools that you use when you're trying to grow your audience and grow your application. So quick introduction. So my name is Thomas. I work for Lyft, which is the number two ride-sharing platform in North America. We are only in North America. We are in Canada and the United States at the moment. And I'm based in Seattle. So the company headquarter is in San Francisco, but I'm based in Seattle. I moved there 2 years ago now, and I'm an Android engineer. And I'm in the growth team, so I'll talk a little bit about that later. There is some echo, by the way. I don't know if I'm the only one hearing it. Uh, all right, so let's talk about A/B testing. So why A/B testing? Um, so you can describe a startup as a human instrument designed to create a new product or service under condition of extreme uncertainty. Uh, and so this quote is from Eric Ries, who wrote the Lean Startup. I don't know if you guys can hear the echo. Is it possible to turn it off? I'm not sure if it's on your side, Vlad.
I will go to engineers and ask them. Maybe it's from them or maybe from Vladimir. Just a second.
Okay, it seems like you guys can hear me well, so I'm just gonna carry on. Uh, yeah, so basically the idea of a startup is to kind of like figure out all the things that you don't know and try to figure it out the fastest possible. And so to do so, there is this loop that we call build, measure, and learn. And so that looks very abstract, but it's actually pretty important to understand that early on. Basically, the faster you can learn, and the faster you can learn if an idea is good or bad, and the faster you can basically grow your audience. And so A/B testing is a good way to kind of like iterate very fast. But just to describe the cycle, you kind of like come up with an idea. You're like, for instance, simplifying my onboarding flow is the best way to increase the people signing up in the application. And so that seems like a pretty reasonable idea. So you're like, okay, it is worth testing. So you build this idea, you build your new sign up flow, and then you basically ship it. But it's very important. So you make it in the product to follow, to follow this loop right here. And then it's very important to measure your assumption because it can seem like a good idea to begin with, but it's not necessarily always going to be the case. And so you need to measure and realize, okay, our intuition was right. We can carry on, or actually, maybe simplifying the sign-up flow is not a good idea, and we should not invest more on that. And so the faster you go through the loop, so you kind of like measure, you look at the data, you learn the insight, and then you come up with like different ideas. Okay, maybe the sign-up flow doesn't matter as much, but what you want is to show the experience to the user as early as possible. And so before you even create an account, we are going to show you what it's like to use the application. And so same, you kind of like build, you ship it, you measure the result, you look at the data, and you kind of get some insights, and then you come up with another idea, which can be completely different from your initial idea or just a slight iteration of your first idea that turns out to be pretty successful. So this loop right here is very important when you basically ship your application and need to learn very fast what works and what doesn't work. So how do you A/B test, and what is A/B tests doing in this whole conversation? So basically, A/B testing is a way to compare two versions of the same variable and try to understand which one is the most effective. And so one way to do that is to build two versions of the same screen, of the same flow, or the same button, and kind of like display some of it to half of your user and display the other version to the other half of your users. So how does it look like when you want to code it, and what would it be like if you had to code, let's say, a very, very basic version of A/B testing, of your A/B testing framework or an A/B test? So you want to basically set up some storage. And by the way, most of the code I'm going to show you is in Kotlin. But that's something that you can pretty easily translate into some Swift. And by the way, if you don't know anything about Kotlin, but you know Swift, you will notice that things are actually very similar, so you shouldn't be too lost here. But so yeah, let's talk about what it would like if you had to write your first A/B test and kind of like implement it yourself. So you need basically those two variables. One is for the storage. I'm going to use the user preferences here to store the initialization. And this other string is just basically the name of your variable. So in this init A/B test method, you're basically going to access the shared preferences for the application. You're going to check if there is already the A/B test initialized, and if it's already there, you're basically gonna get the edits. If it's not there, you're going to initialize it with here we basically use next boolean, which is a way to get a random boolean. So you can assume that it's a 50-50 distribution. So for basically half of your user, next boolean is going to return false, and the other half is going to return true. And so this way, you kind of initialize your experiment, and the name of the experiment here is called A/B test 1. And for A/B test 1, basically half of the user is going to be false, and the other half is going to be true. So that's kind of the initialization. So if basically when you start the application, there is already something registered, it's fine. If it's not, you basically initialize it. And then later on, you're going to create a method to retrieve your A/B test variable. So one easy way to do that would be to basically create this A/B test variable method, get A/B test variable method. And here you see that I'm kind of making it generic enough. So later on, if I want to run several experiments, I can basically pass the name of the experiment as the parameter. So you kind of get your shared preferences again. And by the way, if you're not familiar about shared preferences, it's just a very easy way to store some persisting information on the user's device. So instead of like using a database, which would be probably an overkill for the specific example, we can just rely on shared preferences. And so yeah, so here you're basically going to get your A/B testing storage, and you're going to get the value of the variable that you passed as a parameter. And you can see that here I'm actually setting false, as a default value. That might not be ideal. You probably want to be careful, because if you set false, then that means that probably something went wrong when you initialize your A/B test, and so you basically didn't set the variable, and it's going to default to false. I'm going to talk a little bit about tracking later. You definitely don't want to track the result, the A/B test for the specific users, if basically there was no initialized variable, because that's going to skew the results. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. And so then you basically stitch everything together. So as a reminder, you have initialized your A/B test, and then you created a variable that is assigned to a user for your A/B test. So then at some point, you basically are going to have to display either the A version of your A/B test or the B version. We sometimes talk about control version, which is kind of like the default original version, and the the variant, which is what you actually want to test. So you use basically in a very basic if-else branch, you're going to call get A/B test variable, and you are going to either assign your layout 1, which is kind of like your default your default layout for the sign up screen that you want to test, or you are going to display the layout too if the variable that is initialized is false. So yeah, that's kind of like basically a very basic way to display either the A version or the B version of your layout. But then what is very important is that you need to track the results. You need to see, okay, is one version perform better than the other? To actually know that, you need to record the success, and I say success between air quotes, because it's up to you to define the success. And there are multiple ways to do that. Same, I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But maybe the success is just the user is signing up. So you can say that it's a success. Or maybe, and it's very fine actually when you're starting, it's a good way to kind of like set up the initial, your initial A/B test. But maybe at some point you want to be a little bit more sophisticated than that, and signing up might not be like the only thing that matters. Maybe you want to make sure that it's a quality user that signs up. And I don't know if quality users is the right way to describe your user, but it's a user that is very engaged in your application. And so then signing up is not the only variable that you want to use as a success metric, but maybe it's like how many times the user is going to come back in the next week, for instance, to use your application. So you can be over time get more educated and kind of like identify what's the best success metric. But anyway, for now, we kind of like display the layout and kind of like stitch everything together. And then we need to track the results, as I was saying. So in my case, I'll do something very simple, and I'm just gonna add a listener on the sign up button. And basically, I'm gonna use whatever analytics framework that I'm using. So here I'm using something very generic. I don't think analytics framework is something that exists specifically, but if you create your own analytics framework, you can basically make the call right here to track the event. And when you're tracking the event, it's very important to pass the actual value that is initialized. So is it a user that basically was exposed to the A version of your layout, or was it a user that was exposed to the B version of your layout? And you want to be very careful to track that when you log the click. So later, when you look at the results, you can basically say, okay, X% of my users exposed to A ended up clicking on the button, and X% and Y% of my user in the B version clicked on the button. And that's kind of like the very very basic version of your first A/B test. And obviously, you should also like start your sign up flow basically. If you just track the event when you click on the button, that doesn't really do anything, and you're not going to be able to sign up your user. So basically, after tracking the event, you kind of start the sign. So it's a very simple version of what an A/B test framework would look like if you had to implement it from scratch. And it's kind of interesting to do it maybe for your first experiments if you have the time and you want to familiarize yourself with how it works under the hood. But to be very honest, the good news is that you will probably never have to do that, because there are a lot of like commercial A/B testing frameworks out there that you can use and already come with like a lot of sometimes pretty sophisticated features that you might need down the road. So it can be intimidating at the beginning, but it's definitely worth investing the time to really understand how those A/B testing framework works. And also, by the way, if at that point you're like, okay, I know all these things, don't worry, I'm really starting with the very beginning, but we're gonna kind of like build up in complexity, and I'll talk also about what we are doing at Lyft and how we are doing A/B testing at Lyft. But I wanted to like start with the beginning and talk about A/B testing from the very beginning. So commercial frameworks, so there are multiple. So Optimizely was actually kind of like the first, or at least one of the most famous at the very beginning, and they started with A/B testing on web pages. So they had like this very easy to use SDK that you can, or library, I don't know how you call it in front end development, but they are this very easy library that you can include to your page. And they over time implemented version for Android and iOS. So that's definitely like a very strong player on the A/B testing world. there is also LinPlum. So LinPlum is interesting. They come from the exact opposite. They come with initially an A/B testing SDK for mobile only, and they kind of like built up, and now it's like a very advanced platform. And there is also Optimize, which I never had a chance to use, but is also an A/B testing framework for mobile initially that also enables you to customize. And I think, if I remember correctly, Optimize actually enable you to start running some experiments without necessarily having to code a lot, and a lot of your layouts can be actually generated server side, so it can be a good way to go very fast when you basically want to test multiple things and you have limited engineering resources. You have your PM, for instance, or your designer can be the one building the A/B test and shipping them directly in production without having to redeploy code. And there is Firebase, which probably a lot of you know and are using, whether you are Android engineers or Android developers or iOS developers, or actually even front end now. So yeah, Firebase is really kind of like the best item or the best toolbox, the best tool in the toolbox that we have as mobile developers. One of the good things with Firebase too is that you can start for free and actually go pretty far with the free tier. I don't think that's the case for any of those other players, and it's actually pretty expensive, for instance, to integrate yourself with LinPlum. Same with Optimizely and Optimize. I used to say that the funny story is that there is basically no price on the website of Optimizely, and LinPlum, and it's not because it's free. It's because if you want to sign up, you need to set up a call with their salespeople, and it's usually a pretty expensive contract. So clearly, if you don't have the critical mass, starting with Firebase is the right way to go. So let's take a look at Firebase. Specifically, we're gonna basically run an example using Firebase because, once again, I think it's probably the best way to get your feet wet and start building A/B tests in your own application. So there are basically two components when you want to run A/B test on Firebase. So they have a dedicated A/B testing section in the Firebase console. So if you are already familiar with the Firebase console, you will see that there is a line or there is an item in the list of the options called Firebase A/B testing, I think, or I don't know, A/B testing labs. And there is also the beta mentioned next to it, which is pretty interesting. If you remember using Gmail a while back, they had the beta for like, I don't know, 10 years maybe or something like that. I think it's a little bit the same thing with Firebase A/B testing. It's in beta, but you can definitely use it now. It doesn't mean that it's broken or it's buggy. It's definitely very reliable. And the other thing too is that they have is the remote configuration. And so remote configuration is basically just a way to send your configuration to your client from the server and kind of like deploy some configuration variables and push some configuration variables from your basically your backend or your server or your Firebase console to all the Android application or iOS applications, because it supports both that you have deployed in production. And so remote configuration can be actually used without using A/B test, but it's also like a very, very easy way to run A/B test. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I'll talk about feature flags. The idea of enabling or disabling features is kind of like a strong way to, or a strong component to run A/B test. So let's look a little bit at the console. So if you want to create your experiment, you basically, as I said, click on the A/B testing section. And then you're going to first define the name of your experiment. So you can go with something very simple, as I did here, called sign up flow. You can give a description if you want, but you don't have to. And so as soon as you have a name, then you need to set up the targeting. So that's pretty interesting. Let's talk a little bit about that for a minute. In the very basic initial implementation that I described, I was kind of like showing this kind of like 50% CA, 50% CB, and you kind of like basically have all your users that are kind of part of this A/B test, and basically half are going to see a version and the other half is going to see the other version of your layout. That's a very basic way to do it. In practice, maybe you only want to take a subset of your users. So in this case, for instance, I put 5%. And so it means that only 5% of your users are going to be counted as part of your A/B test. So everybody next are going to see A and are going to see control. And then you're going to take 5% and you're going to split 5% in two. So 2.5% are also going to see A. They are also going to see the default. And 2.5% are going to see the new implementation of your layout that you want to test. And so this way you only have a very, very tiny subset of your users that are part of this A/B test. And so if things are really, really bad, you're basically not going to find yourself losing a lot of users for a month, for instance, because the layout that you're trying to test is just not working. So you need to basically like reduce the amount of people targeted. You need to have a critical mass. So this 5% should be tens of thousands of users, ideally, if you want to get the results fast enough. But yeah, that's definitely something to keep in mind. You don't have to have all your users as part of your A/B test. You can also take a subset. And at some point, you can also even like target some specific users. Like maybe you want to run the experiment only for users in, let's say, a specific geographic region, for instance. I know that Facebook is pretty big on running a lot of their tests only in Australia, for instance, because Australia is not quite like the US, but it's also similar enough to have some very interesting signal early on. So yeah, depending how sophisticated you want to be and how advanced you are at running A/B tests, you can do things that are pretty advanced using Firebase. And then, so Firebase called it the goals. That's kind of what I called the success metrics earlier. Then you are going to define your success metrics. So it can be, an estimated total revenue if you are using Google to, for instance, to enable in-app purchase because everything is connected, and Firebase will know basically how much users bought your in-app purchase. But you can also look at the retention, for instance. That's, as I said, that can be, if you want to evaluate the quality of your users, that can be a good metric, and see how often your users are coming back within the 4 to 7 days after installing the application. So it's up to you to decide, and you can have multiple metrics, but it's kind of important to, before you actually run your experiment, try to see, okay, what is really important for me to improve, and what do I really want to have an impact on. And so then you're going to set up your control group. So I kind of create a parameter called sign up flow, and it's actually something that is going to be used in the remote configuration. So I create this parameter called sign up flow. I pass the value called regular UI, and then I create another parameter. I reuse the sign up flow parameter, and I pass the new UI value. And so by doing that, basically your remote configuration for the users in the A group will be regular UI for the sign-up flow parameter. And for the people in the B group, it's going to be new UI for the same parameter. So how does it work then if you look at the code? So as I said, we are using the remote config. And so it's pretty interesting. Remote config is kind of like its own thing. If you're not very familiar, it's very well documented. And so I recommend maybe to play with it a little bit before you start even to run an A/B test with it, so you just feel familiar. But they have basically two concepts, the concept of fetching and the concept of activating. Remote config, as I said, you basically fetch some flags from the server and you kind of like use them in your application. That's a huge risk of race condition. So you want to be a little bit clever here, and you want to make sure that you have default values that are kind of like hard-coded in your application, and B, you also have a smooth transition between the default values and the values that you fetch from the server. So I don't know, it can be like a loading screen or like some kind of like transition state where you make sure that those variables are kind of like applied and instantiated at the right time and don't create side effects or race conditions. So fetch and activate. So it's basically kind of like the easy way to do it, but you want to be careful where you're going to fetch the values and right away you are going to replace those default variables that you have by the values that you fetch from the server. So you call this method, you had the onComplete listener. It's something that is done asynchronous. And then you check if it's successful because, maybe you're trying to fetch those variables, but maybe the device is offline, for instance. But so if you are online, then you basically are going to access this sign up flow parameter that I was talking about that I set up in the console, and you're going to apply it to the sign up flow variable. And that's pretty much it. Sorry, that's pretty much it. Basically, by just doing that, you kind of like fetch your remote configuration and you kind of initialize your variable. And then that was kind of like the let's stitch everything together section. So then you're basically going to display the appropriate layout. So it's pretty easy. You're going to look the sign up flow variable and you're going to see if it's regular UI. And if it is, then you're going to display the layout one. But if it's not, then you're going to display the layout two, because if it's not regular UI, it means that it's new UI, and so you want to display the second layout. So pretty basic, pretty straightforward. And the good thing is that that's pretty much all you have to do. The good thing with Firebase is that it kind of like takes care of like tracking automatically how your users are like performing while using your application. And you basically don't have to track anything. You don't have to record everything. You basically just fetch whatever the server is sending you. The targeting, like should you show A or B to this user? Everything of that is handled directly by Firebase, so it's not something you have to worry about. So that's pretty straightforward. So quick story time here. So I show you A/B test. I show you how easy it is to set up. The good thing is that there is this expression in the US. It's basically when you hold a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Every problem looks like a nail. And so you suddenly see that A/B tests are relatively easy to run. And you want to literally run A/B tests on everything. And so there is this very famous story from Google at the time when Marissa Mayer was leading some of the engineering on the landing page. And they basically were saying they run 41 version of the same page, and they were just basically changing the value of the blue. So they had like basically 41 different shades of blue just to try to identify what is the best blue and what is the blue. I'm talking about the color of the link, right? When you go on Google and actually pretty much in any search engine right now, the results are, at least they were blue. And so they were like, okay, is there one blue that works better than the other? Let's run an A/B test and let's have 41 version of blue. The problem is that if you do that, then you run into the problem of the significance result that goes down. It's that okay. I'm not really clear when I explain that, but basically, the more you increase your variance, if you have an A/B test with only 2 variants, it's going to be pretty easy to basically assume that okay, I reach statistical significance and my is valid. The problem is that when you start testing multiple variants, you have a lot of noise that is suddenly introduced, and the value of the signal is significantly going down. And so at the end of the day, if you run 41 variants, you have 88% chance at the result to have selected a false positive. And so that means that basically this A/B test is completely useless. You definitely don't want to run an A/B test for every single question that you have. And if you do, you always want to try to have as little variance as possible. So you can have basically a 50-50 split. You can have maybe one control and 2 variants if you have a lot of users and you think that it's gonna be pretty fast to reach the level of statistical significance. But you definitely don't want to run 41 variants. That's basically useless, and you are pretty much sure that the result that you get at the end is bogus. And so I don't know if what level of exposure of math you have, and if you remember the stats class from college, but a good other way to describe it is basically a coin toss. Like if you have a coin and you flip it, and you assume that the coin is balanced, and so it's basically 50-50 for head and tail. If you experiment yourself, and let's say you basically flip the coin like 20 times, statistically speaking, you are rarely going to have 10 tail and 10 head. It's going to be because, nature is not as perfect as a mathematical model. You are going to have, likely, you're going to have only 18% of a 50-50 split. And the coin is balanced, like there is no question. That's actually a coin that is, uh, but still, just, there is like a random factor thing we are doing. Only 18% of the time, it's going to be basically 10 tail and 10 head if you flip it 20 times. And so that means that 18%, so 82% of the time, you're going to find yourself with basically something else. So it can be nine tail and 11 head, but it can be as crazy as only, let's say, 5 heads in 1% of the cases. And so that means 15 tail. And so if you're not careful enough, you basically can like find yourself saying, oh, well, this coin is just returning tails like way more often than it returns head. And so it's kind of like interesting to have, if you don't have it in mind, basically make sure that if you don't have this model in mind, make sure that you basically verify the statistical significance at the end of your experiments, and make sure that you have enough data to basically say with confidence, okay, this coin is balanced or this experiment is successful. And so the good thing is that if you're not super comfortable or the explanation that I just give you doesn't really click, you can just Google statistical significance calculator. And there are actually a lot of statistical significance calculator out there that can enable you to basically say, okay, how many users did I have exposed to my specific control, and how many users did I have exposed to my specific variant? And basically, what is the conversion level, or what is the success level? How many people actually signed up, for instance, in the case of our sign up screen. And so then those tools, and I'm using the SurveyMonkey one because I think it's just nice and it works very well, and they kind of like give you some level of explanation as you are using it. But yeah, this tool is going to tell you, okay, you have a statistical significant result. You're going to actually select the level of confidence, because it's impossible to be 100% sure that you have the right result, but you can basically have some level of confidence. So I don't know, I guess if you work in, let's say, the medical industry and you are testing, I don't know, let's say a vaccine, for instance, which is pretty trendy these days, you definitely want to make sure that, okay, that has like a very, very high level of confidence. So you probably want to check this 99% confidence checkbox right here. But in our case, it's probably okay to just like settle with 95% confidence, and kind of like go from there. Because basically the higher confidence level you request, and the longest your experiment is going to run. So you should definitely make sure that you take that into account when you run your experiment. But yeah, 95% seems like a good idea. So that was a very brief intro to A/B testing. I talked a little bit about the pitfalls. I talked a little bit about how to write your own A/B testing framework, and then I told you don't do it because there are a lot of tools that enable you to do it way faster. I'm going to talk a little bit about Lyft, but I guess that's maybe a time where, Vlad, I'm going to include you back in the conversation. Vladimir, can you hear me?
Vladimir had some connection problems, so
Okay.
I think we can just continue, and when Vladimir comes back, he will ask all questions he has.
That sounds great. Yeah, that sounds
Okay, let's
perfect.
continue. Thank you.
All right.
I'm here.
So let's.
Oh, Vladimir
I'm
is back.
here.
Yeah. So I don't know if you hear.
Yeah, I'm here. Everything's fine.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know if. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. So my question was, so basically, you're saying us that it is bad that we missed our statistics class in college. So we need this knowledge for our mobile engineering nowadays, right?
Yeah, so that's the part. Even if I graduated as an engineer, I was not really good in math. That was not my favorite part of my what I did in school. So I'm not necessarily in love with math, but yeah, it's interesting to at least understand this idea of um, what does it mean to kind of like look at a random phenomenon, and also the fact that all those results are also independent. Like I think I didn't talk about Gaussian distribution and the curve, the bell curve graph, but yeah, you guys, if you guys did some stats, you probably recognize that. But that's kind of like the idea. It's like you have something that is like a natural phenomenon, and every time you flip a coin, it's independent, right? When you flip the coin, it doesn't really matter what you get before, or it doesn't really matter what you're going to get after. And so we use this Gaussian curve to kind of like modelize it. And so that means that, yeah, in some cases, it's very rare, but you can probably even like end up with like only one tail and 19 head, and it's not impossible. It's just extremely rare, but it's not impossible. And you should also like take that into account if at the end of your experiment you're like, oh, this screen is working so much better than control one that we have. Well, you should say that only after you made sure that you have statistical significance, and you can use the tool. You don't have to do the math yourself.
Yep. Do you have any ideas how to quickly catch up with this statistic thing? So only the, I don't know, applied knowledge, so that you can quickly know what you need to understand, so that your A/B tests are working properly.
Yeah, so I think most of the things that I said can be almost enough if you want to start. You don't have to basically spend too much time doing the math, because as I said, there are like some statistical significance tools out there. If you are using Firebase, or really if you are using any other tools, they are going to do the math for you and tell you, okay, that's reliable, that's statistical significance there. It's always good to, if you know it, you can potentially, find like errors, because the tools, as great as they are, sometimes they are, if you feed in bad data, for instance, the tools can like can say, oh, it's great. Yeah, that's exactly the result you want. And it turns out you were just providing bad data. So the math was wrong from the get-go. But so you need to be able to kind of like check, or at least have a hunch that, okay, that looks a little bit fishy here. What's going on? But overall, a lot of those tools makes you run A/B tests without having to know the math too much. But if you are really interested, there are a lot of really good training online. I know that actually Google created something with Udemy, I think. And I don't know if it's a nano degree or just one of these class, but they are basically a training online that kind of walks you through A/B testing, kind of like the logic and the math behind it. I don't remember exactly, but I think if you look for Google A/B testing class or training, you probably will find it. And there are a lot of like really good resources out there that you can look at, or even videos if you are interested. So it depends how deep you want to go with the theoretical aspect. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for this heads up. So I think we can continue.
Cool. All right. So let's resume the presentation. So yeah, so I told you about like the basics and also like the tools that you can use. But obviously Lyft is now pretty big. And so there are a lot of tools that were totally satisfactory when we started that we can't really use anymore. Let's start, for instance, by talking a little bit about architecture. So I'm probably not the best person to talk about architecture, and I'm sure that there are a lot of like really good architecture talks today. But basically, if you look at clean architecture and you look at the pros and the cons, the pros is clearly you have a very consistency in your implementation of the business logic. You can also like swap framework integration if you want to change your HTTP stack, for instance. It's very easy if you follow clean architecture. If you want to change the way you are persisting data on the device, it's also pretty easy. And it's also easily testable, which is very important. You want to make sure that you have solid unit tests, at least unit tests running for your app. And on the other end, obviously, it comes with a little bit of like things that makes it a little bit heavy and not super flexible, not always very flexible. So you have a lot of boilerplate code. I guess Kotlin is helping comparing to Java on Android, but you still have some code that sometimes you're like, okay, that's might not be necessary, but for the sake of consistency, let's follow this pattern. And sometimes it's also an overkill. But the interesting part is that it also makes it pretty easy to A/B test. And so when you have like a proper clean architecture implemented, it's definitely easier to and so so if we look at the way clean architecture can be like very easily summarized, you basically have your data layer, so it's like just to the network. Then you have your domain layer, and usually you have like kind of like DTO conversion basically between the data layer and the domain layer. And then you have the presentation layer that is kind of like the rendering, the views, everything that is UI related. And more often than not, it's actually what you run A/B test on. I mean, you can run A/B test on the network stack. I think that makes sense. Maybe you want to compare, okay, which network stack is better than the other. But to be very honest, that's not really what we are talking about today. Like a lot of the growth is like based on like, okay, which flow is better, what makes more sense for the user. And so you more often than not run your A/B test in the presentation layer. And so if I zoom a little bit, the presentation layer, so you have your models that are basically, yeah, I guess you can say that you have the model in the presentation layer. That might be actually, yeah, it's questionable. You can also have them in the domain layer. But anyway, you have your models that are going to have some changes, and then your presets are going to reflect those changes in the views. And then if you go back up the stack, any user interaction on the views are going to be basically registered by the presenters. And if there is some model changes, the presenters are going to update your model to reflect the changes, the interactions of the users. So let's pause a little bit and talk about filter toggles here. One good thing about A/B test is that it's actually based on things that have been used in the industry for a while. And so our feature flags is one of those. So there is a pretty interesting article on Martin Fowler's blog talking about it. But the idea is that you can basically change the behavior without changing the code. And so it's not like you don't write any code anymore, but it's just that you write the code, you ship it behind the feature flag, and then at some point, if you want to enable it, you just change the value of the feature flag, and that's something that can be done from the server. That's kind of what remote configurations that I talked about in the context of Firebase are a little bit. And so therefore, you can enable or disable a feature, and potentially you can enable it or disable it for some group of your users, and boom, there you go, you have the A/B test mechanism there. So feature flags is actually a very, very, very powerful tool to use in the context of your presentation layer. And so at Lyft, we are actually using feature flags a lot. That's basically kind of like what we are using for our A/B test. We're not using Firebase. But so we have this concept of like individual feature flags. And so the way we are implementing it is pretty straightforward. We have this singleton feature provider that is basically provided via our dependency injection framework. And so you kind of like have it pretty much anywhere you need it. And so, I mean, as long as you inject it there, but it's something that is like very easy to access, and you can use basically anywhere in your presenter. And so you basically check if your feature is enabled by calling the isEnabled method and passing the name of your feature. And so we have basically this features class that lists all our A/B tests and all our features. And so if the answer is yes, if the result is true, then you basically display your new feature. So it can be anything. You can like show a button, hide a button, show layout, etc., etc. But this display new feature right here is basically what's going to the method that's going to take care of displaying the feature. So if I come back to clean architecture and my presentation layer modelization right here, a good way to put your feature provider is to kind of like make them available directly in your presenter. And so your presenter is going to be the one kind of like, as I said, like getting the models and translating it into views and potentially registering the interaction of the user and reflecting that in the model. But it's also the presenter that's going to be in charge to look at the value of your specific feature and for instance, decide to hide some part of the view or change some part of the view or change the behavior of your UI altogether. So that's basically kind of like the way you would fit A/B testing in a clean architecture organization of your code. So how does it work at Lyft? So just to give you a little bit of context and to basically explain you why everybody coding their own A/B test, for instance, in the code would be probably unmanageable. So we have something like 70 Android engineers. We have more than 120 Android A/B tests running at the same time. And so I haven't checked. So obviously, because of COVID right now, things are a little bit different than they were a few months ago. And maybe this number is a little bit lower than it was, but that was kind of like basically a normal time at Lyft. We have more than 120 A/B tests running at the same time. On top of that, when it comes to like the architecture and the organization, we are heavily relying on modularization. We have more than 2,000 modules, but it's going to continue going up significantly. That's, by the way, why we started using Bazel and titch Gradle. That's a topic of another talk, I guess. But yeah, if you are interested in learning how we are modularized and heavily modularized the code base, you can probably find very interesting talks about it. And we are also running a weekly app release cadence. So that means that every week we are basically releasing a new version of the Android application. So just to give you the context of how things are on the Android side at Lyft, that clearly forces you to have some level of organization and consistency to basically run your A/B test at scale. So just to talk a little bit about the way we are doing UI. So a while back, I think that was almost 4 years ago now, there was this kind of debate around should we use fragment, should we not use fragment? A lot of people were like, let's use basically one activity and let's display all our screen, all our views within the activities. And let's not use fragments. So Lyft actually kind of like followed this trend by building Scoop, which is our single activity framework. There is an open source version that you can find, but I would say the internal version that we are using is probably very different now from the open source version. We kind of like integrated it with Dagger and the dependency injection framework. So yeah, it's a little bit different from what we have in the open source version, but it's still very much there. And that basically enables us to build UI with a very high level of consistency and still making sure that there is like enough flexibility and we are still like productive enough. I know that people who like fragments say that managing the lifecycle is not that complicated. I haven't used fragments in a while, but I still think that might not be necessarily the easiest API or the easiest, the easiest to use. And so Scoop was definitely very helpful for us to kind of like enable us to build UI at scale and kind of like with enough speed. And so later on, we kind of introduced this concept of Scoop plugin, and it was very well thought with feature flags, and the ability to kind of like toggle or disable or enable a plugin. And so the way it works, and it's obviously a very simplified version of it, you have all the things that I was talking about earlier. So you have the API, the repository, this concept of service, the Android service, but more like service from like the architectural perspective. And so all these things right here, and yeah, I put an interactor here. I think a lot of what we are using right now, it's either MVVI architecture with or without interactor, or sometimes even with the view model directly without necessarily using interactor. But just to give you an idea, you have basically all this part right here that is unit testable. So it basically doesn't use some pure, it uses some pure Java or pure Kotlin code and doesn't use any of the Android specific APIs. And it's separated from the Vue plugin section right here, which is kind of like in charge of like rendering the UI and kind of like actually implement some Android specific APIs. And I'm obviously overly simplifying things here, but that's just to give you an idea of like the separation that we decided to go with when it comes to the UI. And so the good thing is that this is, sorry, this is either things that you're going to build yourself or things that you're going to rely on that were built by other people. But you have something that is very self-contained right here in the Vue plugin that enables you to run your A/B test without necessarily having any impact on this side of your implementation. So everything is contained in the controller and the views. And so we actually have this concept of plugin manager at Lyft. So this is basically this class that is also, it's not a singleton, but it's something that can be provided via our dependency injection framework. And so it enables you to attach and detach a specific plugin. So by plugin, you think about a view that is self-contained, and I'm going to talk about that more in detail in a second. And you can decide to attach it to a layout that already exists. And so the good thing is that any screens can be basically can receive plugins that can be attached or detached to it. And you can even add Vue plugins in other Vue plugins. And so all of that is handled by the plugin manager, and it's gonna make sense in a second. But that's a very, very powerful way to run your A/B test, because suddenly you can decide to attach or detach a specific Vue plugin and show it to your users or not, depending on the status of the feature provider for the specific feature. So actually, to give like a very clear example, you can have your feature provider and check if your feature is enabled. I don't know if you remember earlier, I had display my new feature method. So with this concept of plugin manager, you basically just call your plugin manager and attach with the dependency the Vue plugin for your new feature directly into the parent view. So parent view can be like the full layout of your screen, or it can be just like a specific subset or a specific subsection of the layout that is currently displayed. And so as you see, it's very, very easy actually in your code to kind of like decide to attach or not a plugin to your view, depending on the status of the feature provider for your feature. So let's take an example right here. So that's actually the driver screen, and that's the driver profile screen, sorry. And so you can see that here we have some plugins that have plugins inside. So for instance, this basic profile basic info plugin, which is this section right here, where there is the name, the car, the number of ride, etc., etc. It has its own plugin for the photo right here. And a plugin actually is not necessarily just a view. Like you can also have the actual API calls that are embedded in the plugin. So you can have like some potential business logic that is also not directly embedded in the plugin, but kind of like accessible through the plugin. So yeah, so it's kind of like a good way to have like something that is like extremely self-contained. And so yeah, and so you can see that there's the profile account, plugin right here, the vehicle info plugin, and the feedback plugin. So what if, let's say, we want to run an A/B test on deciding to show the feedback plugin or hiding it, and see, okay, is it really useful? And by the way, the feedback here is enabling the driver to see the comments that were shared by the passengers for the specific driver. And we are thinking, okay, that's basically an experiment that we can run, right? How useful is it to make the feedback readable on the driver side? So to do that, what we can do is in the driver profile overview controller, which is kind of like the controller that kind of like contain the whole screen, we are going to inject the plugin manager. We are going to inject the feature provider to basically enable us to check the status of the A/B test. And we are going to inject also other things, but that's not really important for our example. And so in this unattached method, because coop actually come with unattached and undetached, and that's the only thing that we are using to manage the lifecycle of our views. So we kind of like try to simplify it, or at least all the other lifecycle methods are kind of like handled by Scoop behind the scenes. So in the unattached, we are going to check the feature provider and see if the driver feedback display is enabled. And if it is, then we are going to call the plugin manager and attach the view plugin, the feedback plugin basically to our view, and passing basically the dependencies. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, but that requires you to kind of pass the dependencies through the constructor. And then we are going to inject it in this specific part of the layout. So you pass basically the ID of the view you want to display your feedback plugin in. And that's pretty much it. And that's all you have to do. So it kind of enables you, I guess there's a lot on this screen, but it's just because I had to display it in big font and kind of like cram it. But yeah, it basically shows you how to display things directly in your screen. A very easy way, a very maintainable way, and it's also very consistent because a lot of the way we are running A/B tests like that. So if you jump around the code, you can very easily identify what is an A/B test and what isn't. So that was kind of like the code and the architecture. Let's talk very briefly about tooling. So we actually started when I joined Lyft almost 5 years ago now. We kind of like decided to go with LinPlum. So I'm pretty familiar with LinPlum that I talked at the very beginning in the commercial framework section. But we very early on realized that it makes a ton of sense for us to build our own A/B testing framework. So we have the backend, we have the front end that comes along with it. It's called TCS, for Target Configuration Service. And it basically has a lot of like Lyft specific features. For instance, the metrics, as I said, I was talking about the success metrics. We have it tightly connected with our backend and our analytics pipeline. So for instance, we have some very Lyft specific metrics like how many rides a driver gave between 0 and 7 days after the sign up, for instance, which is something that we are looking a lot as a success metrics. Or like how many, as a passenger, how many rides did you took in the past 30 days, which is also something that we are really interested in. So we tend to run a lot of A/B tests with that as a success metrics. And so all those things are, as I said, Lyft specific. And so to have them available, it made sense to kind of like build this tool ourselves. The alternative being to send all those data to a third party, but when you basically reach some scale, it's for a lot of reasons makes a lot of sense to have this data in house and not having to share it with third parties to run A/B tests. So that's a tool that is also used for remote configuration, so kind of like remote config on Firebase. So you don't have to run A/B tests. You can also just decide, okay, I want to assign all those users in this specific region to this specific value. That's something that you can do with TCS, but you can also use it for experimentations too, and set 50-50, for instance, of those users see this version and that version, and you start the experiment and look at the results down the road. So yeah, as I said, why do we go with a homemade solution? No SDK. So it's very important as your code base grows to make sure that you control as much as possible the SDKs that are used in the app. And so not having to rely on a third-party SDK is very important. And also, as I said, a direct connection to the Lyft data platform. So we can run powerful queries if we want at the end to basically look at very specific impact of a very specific experiment on a very specific metrics. And we also have a ton of targeting flexibility. I forgot to talk about that, but that's also interesting. Lyft is organized by what we call markets, but usually it's like a region around an airport. That's kind of how we tend to organize the level of granularity basically we use from a geographical standpoint. And so if we want to run an experiment just in the Seattle area, for instance, that's something that we can do very easily, and we can target, for instance, just drivers who are eligible to drive, let's say, in Seattle. That's something that we can do very easily using TCS because we kind of built this capability in the tool. If we were using, I don't know, let's say Firebase, for instance, I doubt that would be super easy to do, and you would have to rely on approximation, and that would probably not be perfect. So yeah, that's a good rationale to invest into your own A/B testing platform after a few years when you are very familiar with A/B testing. Another thing that is very useful is the dev panel. So we have basically a dev section that is only available for the debug build. That's not really original. I know that basically a lot of companies in the industry are doing that. The cool part is what I'm displaying right now, like the section that has the feature flags. So you can directly enable and disable a feature flag directly from the app. You don't have to override something on the back end and try to make sure that you target your user or something like that. Things can be very easily overridden from the application. And so when you are testing your own A/B test or your own feature that is behind the feature flag and you need to debug, that's actually very useful to have it a few taps away directly in the app. You don't have to run command lines or like go on like a front end, a web page to enable or disable a feature. Everything is running directly on the device. And when you are testing it in the real world, and you also want to enable and disable the feature, and you just have your phone on you and you are like, I don't know, waiting for something, that's also something very, very useful. And actually, that's the part that I wanted to share. I was pretty excited about. That's something that is very proprietary, what I just displayed. But I came across this library called Beagle. It's only on Android, but it enables you to kind of like create your own debug panel, basically. And it's heavily customizable. So you can, for instance, like add a lot of your feature flags directly in there and disable and enable some features as you are using your application. So yeah, if you are interested in starting using feature flags, but you also want some how would I say that, the flexibility basically to enable and disable them directly from your device, you should take a look at Beagle. It's pretty cool. Yeah, so just to briefly talk about the timeline. So I talk about all the tools that we are using and how we basically like setting up this architecture that was made A/B testing very easy, but that's something that obviously happened over time. That's not something that you build in one day. So just to give you a quick idea of the timeline. So we kind of started running A/B tests using the Linplum SDK in September 2015. Then by the end of 2015, we started enriching some of the data on the Linplum backend, so sending some anonymized user information to the Linplum backend to improve the targeting, for instance. And then at the the beginning of 2016, we decided to remove the Limplum SDK. So the apps were not integrating the Limplum SDK anymore, but we still use the SDK through the backend. So we basically had this situation where the app was like sending some info to the backend, and then the backend was like sending back this information to Limplum. And that was a good way to kind of like, as I said, like have some control over the code that is running in your application. When you use an SDK, you don't really know, you don't always know basically what's happening in the app. And at the end of 2016, we basically started using our own experimentation framework, so TCS, that obviously has gotten better and better over time. And so today, virtually every engineering team at Lyft is running A/B tests. So we have more than 1,000 experiments running at any time. So not all of it is obviously on Android. There is also like some front end and some back end experiments too. But yeah, that's basically a lot of what we are doing. Even if you are working on like a core feature, it's always important to have an idea of like the impact that it has on your users. And so you want to ship it behind a feature flag in case something goes wrong and you want to disable it. But you also want to see, okay, how does it compare with what we have before, just to make sure that it's at least as good as the original and it doesn't, I don't know, degrades the experience for your users. Or even as I was talking about, like when you run an A/B test on your networking stack, that's something that you want to make sure that has at least like a neutral impact on your users and your application. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you for a great presentation. So we have another, I think, 8 minutes for questions. So Peter will be monitoring the chat. If you have any incoming questions from the audience, I got a couple of questions from my side as well. So let's talk about it. So the first one to ask is, how do you decide if the feature requires an A/B test or not? Are there any so small features that no tests are required?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So it's funny, the way we started, there was one team that was in charge of, and I was part of this team that was in charge of like growth and running A/B tests. And so we were at the beginning the only one running A/B tests, but over time we kind of like set up the method and the knowledge basically on like all the things that can go wrong and all the little tips and the little things you should think about when you run an A/B test. And that was kind of like spread to all the company. And so, as I said, now it's pretty much impossible to ship something, to ship a new feature without having an A/B test running, even for something very minor. I mean, obviously, if it's a bug, you're probably not going to put it behind an A/B test because you are fixing a bug. So you know that it's probably better for the user to have the fixed version than having the buggy version. But other than that, for pretty much everything you are shipping, as I said right before, you always want to make sure that it doesn't have a negative impact. And so it's probably a good idea to test it. As I said, except if it's a bug, then you should just fix the
bug. By the way, I have a question from myself, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you have such cases when you had opposite features, like opposite versions of screen, opposite forms of button, and your A/B testing showed you some results? You applied it to your application, but users' life experience were the opposite. So from A/B testing, you thought that it will be a great feature, but your users were disappointed. Did you have such cases?
Yeah. I'm saying yes. I'm trying to think. I don't know if that happened a lot to me personally, but it's a very common thing to do. And one way to prevent that is to run some potential user experience test before, before you actually start building it. You kind of share, like, let's say, I don't know, a mock or like, a fake version of your UI and try to see what the user are saying. Does it look confusing or does it look like great? But most of the time, that doesn't happen, but that's also not completely uncommon. I'm also thinking about, the redesign of the Facebook feed, like a very long time ago. That was almost like, I don't know, more than 10 years ago now, when Facebook redesigned their Facebook feed on the web. A lot of people were like very unhappy about it, but they know internally that behave and perform significantly better than what they had before. So it's I would say it's pretty common. Nothing really comes to mind lately. Another example, it's actually a little bit more on the opposite, is when we did the redesign. We kind of like did the redesign, a new branding of the app, and we run an A/B test, and we realized that the new design is significantly worse than the old design. And so it's pretty interesting because you're like, okay, it looks so much better, it's nicer, more designers were involved, but there is a lot of like user experience features that don't really make sense or like are not necessarily as polished as what we had before. And so what we did is basically like changing and kind of like start looking at the details. Okay, is this button better than this one? Is this flow better than this one? And over time kind of like brought the new design back to the original design when it comes to the performances. So yeah, so it's not really as simple as like, okay, it works better, we ship it, or okay, it's not as bad, it's not as good, let's not ship it. Yeah, there are a lot of details that you should look into over time when you start tests.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Vladimir, some questions from you.
Okay, another question is, so other question is, so obviously you have unit tests, like static analysis and that so on in your pipeline. So in order to have the feature complete, you basically need everything else to be checked, right? So with A/B testing, does it work the same way? So there's some check there. So yeah, A/B test is provided for this feature.
You mean for the instrumentation testing, for instance? Or can you hear me?
Yes.
I was saying, so the question is about instrumentation testing and the testing pipeline. Is that asking, Vladimir?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, yeah, that was actually a little tricky. So I talk about unit test a little bit. I think unit test is probably like the first line of defense that you want to set up. And it's true that more often than not, testing your UI with A/B tests is pretty hard. More often than not, we have some UI on what we call the golden path, which is kind of like the most important screen flows in the application, but we don't have like a 100% coverage of UI testing. And so what we do is that by default, all the A/B tests are disabled when we are running our UI test. And so if it's a successful A/B test, then after a while, when we ship it, we write the UI test for the specific new flow. But more often than not, when we run a test, we don't necessarily write a UI test for it because it can be a waste of time if you realize that it's not going to be used in the application, or you need more work to improve it.
Okay, thank you so much, Thomas, for your answer and for your performance. We have only just 20 seconds left, so you can move to discussion zone. It will be in Zoom. You can find link in your Telegram channel. And again, thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Vladimir. It was very interesting performance.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.